Friends, would you please join with me in the spirit of prayer? Gracious God, may the meditations of all of our minds, may the thoughts roaming around our hearts and the very stirrings of our spirit this day be open to these words that we have just heard. And may they become for us a light to our path for the living out of this day and for every day this week. We ask and offer all of this in the name of the one who lived a life fully alive in your presence, Jesus our Christ. Amen. If you remember only one thing about the sermon this morning, I hope and I pray that it's this, that the Hebrew Scriptures are about more than simple stories of a God who goes around smiting people. Contained within the First Testament, there are numerous stories that when I hear them, they reverberate, they resonate within my life. Even though the story Leonard just read to you is over 3,000 years old, it still connects to events and experiences and encounters that I've had within my own life. Let's delve a little deeper into that and see how it might be. You start off with the central character here, who is King David. And we've been learning a lot about him. King David, he was kind of this great combination. He had the military intelligence of General Patton. He had the eloquence of Sidney Poitier. I dare say he had the smile of Brad Pitt and the natural charisma of Will Smith. This is the kind of guy who leaves puddles of personality everywhere he goes. And the passage that we just heard today tells us that everyone loved David. Everywhere David went, people swooned over him. We hear that King Saul's children, Jonathan and Michaela, loved David. We hear that the servants swooned the moment he stepped into the room. The crowds cheer and chant, welcome him home. I dare say that the sheep would willingly shear themselves and knit a pair of socks for him just to be close to him, right? Everybody seems to think that he's the best thing ever. And that word love is used 6 times in the passage. So much so, that by the time I get to the end of it, it feels a bit too sugary sweet to me. It feels like how when I was a kid and went to the Iowa State Fair and ate a whole bag of cotton candy, that's how I kind of feel reading this. Doesn't somebody realize that maybe David isn't all that and a bag of chips? I mean, maybe, sure, he has his graces and his gifts, but he also has his flaws and his faux pas. He's human, just like any of the rest of us. As a matter of fact, if you read that passage close enough, what you start to see is that the love that people are offering David is traveling down a one-way street that dead ends right at David's doorstep. Go back sometime this week, reread the passage. Nowhere in those words does it ever say that David reciprocates or returns the love and the affection that is showered upon him. That love becomes a one-way street. It's as though only he can receive it. And we're left kind of wondering, does he ever offer love in return? Perhaps that, along with other things, is what gets King Saul's goat. King Saul and David have this interesting relationship. On the one hand, I think King Saul admires David, right? Last week, David faced down Goliath and proved his military prowess. This week, we hear how King Saul sent David out on these military campaigns, and wherever David goes, he's successful. Other passages in 1 Samuel talk about how when King David played his lyre and sang for Saul, it soothed his very soul. But on the other hand, King David frustrates Saul. Not to mention, one of the things, of course, is that chant that the crowd sings today, right? David's coming back from battle, and they're singing about how David has killed 10,000 people, and Saul, maybe he's gotten 1,000. We'll round up, right? Maybe that's what gets his goat, or maybe it's just somehow or another being in his presence. There's something that awakens both admiration, but also some anxiety and some anger, and that resonates with me. As I think about relationships in my own life, who is that person? That person in your family, in your neighborhood, maybe even here at the church or in the community, who on the one hand you admire and you look up to, and on the other hand you just kind of frustrates you and causes this powerful concoction of a tension really within you. Who is that person when you walk into the room and you see him standing over there? At first you're like, oh, maybe I'll go over and talk to them. And then you kind of find yourself holding back, getting a little angry, saying, look at that person over there, breathing in and out. Who do they think they are? God's gift to oxygen? Right? There are people I think every single one of us knows. On the one hand, we admire, and on the other hand, awakens anxiety or anger or all kinds of emotions. When we find ourselves trying to relate to people like that, we are slipping into Saul's sandals. It frustrates Saul so much, and I don't want the moment to pass because the ending of this passage is so wonderful. It's kind of biblical humor at its best. Now, I usually don't go for violence, but it's kind of a violent scene at the end where Saul throws this spear at David. I picture David kind of leaning up against the wall, kind of like James Bond doing one of these at people as they pass by. And all of a sudden, as he's standing there, this spear comes whoosh, zooming past, and it lands with a thud right next to him in the wall. And I imagine David going, did someone just throw a spear at? But before he can complete that sentence, another spear comes whoosh, zooming past and lands on the wall right next to David. All of a sudden, we realize perhaps why Saul could only kill 1,000 people. Maybe not the best aim in the kingdom. So if you only carry one thing with you out of the sanctuary today, I hope it's starting to get an appreciation for a connection that the Old Testament, it's not just about a God who smites people. There are relationships described in the First Testament that can connect to our lives. If you carry two truths with you out of the sanctuary this morning, I hope that second truth might be that relationships are messy. They're complicated, and the passage this morning shines a light on that truth. We could address all sorts of relationships that are in between those words that Leonard read to you today. There are relationships of family, King Saul to his children. There are relationships between friends, Jonathan to David or Saul to David. There are nation-state relationships, community relationships, church relationships. All of those are recorded right there. You know, oftentimes, even though we all live in those relationships simultaneously, still to this day, you know, family, friends, community, church, nation-state, even though those relationships are the same for us, we don't often step back and think about how to be in relationship. Have you ever sat down with a piece of paper and a pen or pencil and actually written down what does it mean to be in a healthy relationship with your family, with your friends, with your neighbors, with other church members here? And that leads me to a question, you know, as a church, is what we're interested in just being friendly to each other? Or maybe does being part of a church mean that we're caring for each other's souls, and that might require something else, something deeper in our relationships with each other? What does it mean to be in relationship with the wider Sarasota community, with this country, with the world? When have you ever stepped back and actually thought about that? A passage like this gives us pause. It raises that question, what does it mean to be in relationship with each other? Being in a relationship means that, each one of us walks around with this personal bubble. And inside the personal bubble is the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. Spotlight on me, thank you very much, right? But to enter into a connection with somebody else means that someone else's bubble interacts with ours. And it doesn't just brush up against it. It actually comes together. It gets woven together with ours. And as those two come together, there's this creative energy. Something new, something different happens when two people connect with each other. And that's true whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, anything that goes deeper than the connection you have with your barista at Starbucks. You have to allow that kind of space to connect deeply with someone. We hear that in the passage this morning. Jonathan connects deeply with David. So much so that he takes the very robe off of his back and gives it to him. It's a surrendering of political power. But he goes deeper than that. He takes the sword and the belt and gives it to David. It's maybe an act of deference, but also what it is, it's an act of trust. Jonathan is saying, I trust you to defend me, to keep me safe, David. And Jonathan and David make this covenant with one another. That makes me think about marriages. There's a couple folks I'm working with right now in preparation for their weddings in the coming months. And we talk about that in our premarital time. We talk about our individual bubbles and how they connect and how there's a creative space and energy that's awoken in that moment. But I also talk about how the truth is that when you marry someone else, you also marry their family. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. It's all there. And that's true in the passage today. Jonathan and David's friendship also comes with King Saul. And as you look at that passage, you see that the way Saul sees his son Jonathan relating to David, that's part of what makes him lean towards that anger and that anxiety and that frustration. It stirs so much within him that it leads to the violent act at the very end. Carry two truths with you. The Old Testament's about more than an angry God. There are relationships described in there. And those relationships are just as complicated and complex and messy and beautiful as the relationships we experience today. And if you carry three things with you out of the sanctuary this morning, I pray the third truth would be a question that comes from that relationship between Jonathan and David. You see, Jonathan doesn't just give him material things like the robe and the belt. He doesn't just make some kind of legal connection with him through the covenant. No, Jonathan actually gives David his soul. The word for soul in Hebrew is neeps. Everybody say neeps with me. Neeps. Neeps isn't just about some kind of spark or light that's separate or somehow contained within you. Neeps means your essential life. In the Hebrew understanding, the soul was always interconnected and intertwined with your whole life. The soul was a mirror of that. It was intricately intertwined. There was no way you could tell where the soul started and the rest of your life began. It was all one in the same. That was your neeps. But you didn't just keep that for yourself. Your soul was meant to be shared with others. And Jonathan goes and pours his soul, his neeps, offers his whole life to David. So who? Who are you pouring your life into right now? Who are you making that connection with? Maybe it's not a who, maybe it's a what. Maybe it's a job, or you're volunteering, or maybe you're pouring your life right now into catching up on every episode of I Love Lucy on TV Land. I don't know what you're pouring your life into, and if you don't know, look at your calendar. Your calendar is an ethical document that tells you where you're offering your time, where you're offering that to others. Who? What are you pouring your life into right now? Carry that with you out into the world. Let it stir within your neeps, within your whole life. Maybe even rearranging the furniture a bit in the coming weeks. And if there are 4 things you want to carry with you this week, I want to say to you, really? Isn't 3 enough? It's July. It's hot out there. Do you really want 3 things? Or I could say what we always say to our children, which is, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. 3 is enough. So take those 3 things with you, would you please? The First Testament is about more than an angry God. There's beauty and there's power in this First Testament. Focus on those relationships in your own life and ask yourself that question, what am I pouring my neeps, my life into? And as you carry that with you, may that be a blessing, and may it yield moments of God's grace every day this week. Thanks be to God. Amen.